Welcome back to the Parillaworks channel. My name is John, and this is the start of another large Apothecary cabinet build. What you're looking at is a huge stack of lumber. It's about 250 board foot of mahogany, pine, and soft maple. I'm getting started here with some of the 8/4 mahogany. I'm getting it rough cut with a circular saw. Then I'll take it over to the joiner and get the milling process started. This cabinet is going to be about 6 feet long and 3 feet tall, and the depth is about 15 inches. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking this 8/4 board, I'll get a clean edge on it, I'll take it to the table saw and rip it down to a rough width, and then I'll begin the resawing process. Now, as I've done in the past, I prefer to do as much resawing as possible on the table saw. I'm just more comfortable that way. But this board is obviously too wide for the table saw to completely resaw, which would be in the neighborhood of about 6 inches. This board is wider than that. It's about 7.5 to 8 inches wide. So I'll do as much as I can here at the table saw, and I have a feather board set up as well as an infeed roller behind me to make sure that I get as clean of a cut as possible. And then after that, I'll take it over to the bandsaw to complete the resawing process. Now, because I used the table saw, I'm left with about 2 inches or so of material in the middle, and that's what the bandsaw will take care of. I'm using a 3/8 inch blade because that's just generally what I keep on the bandsaw these days, and you can see that there's much less stress on the bandsaw, and for me, there's much less stress as well. Towards the end of the cut, I'll run around to the back of the saw and pull the board through the saw because I don't have much outfeed support. Now I'll head back to the jointer and I'll clean up one face, and then I'll also clean up an edge so that I can glue up this panel. Now, because I resawed these boards, I'm left with a beautiful book match panel, and those will be surrounding the whole cabinet. So the top, bottom, and two sides will be nice book match quarter sawn mahogany panels. But the inner framework of this project is going to be a series of dividers that will primarily be made of white pine, and I use white pine because it saves weight. These cabinets get so heavy, especially when you get all the drawers in there, that anything I can do to kind of save a little bit of weight, I try to do. Now, the pine does save a little bit of money, but the main reason is the weight. So here you see me getting one of those book match panels back to the joiner. This is putting my 16-inch joiner to the test, and I would say that it passed with flying colors. Most of these panels came out about as flat as I could hope for, and they're definitely flat enough for the purposes of this build. This is one of the shorter panels, but the longer ones came out just as good as the short ones. Now, the client for this build is going to use this cabinet to hold shoes or shoe boxes in each drawer. So that's sort of what dictated some of the dimensions. We needed a specific dimension for the inside of the drawer, and then we kind of worked our way out to see what we needed for the final depth. And I think it ended up being about 15.25 inches to get everything we needed. Now, I used the track saw to cut the top and bottom panels to their final length, and they're just clamped together so that they're exactly the same. And then I'll use the miter sled at the table saw to cut the sides to their final length, and I'll keep this setting on my miter sled the same until I cut the inner dividers. I use dowels for the joinery and the outer casework. Now, this is the Dowel Max doweling jig that I've used on this channel for a number of years, and I went with 3/8 inch by 2-inch dowels, and I was able to fit, I think, 10 dowels per corner, which was a pretty snug fit as far as the glue up is concerned, but it should be pretty strong long term. Before moving on any further, I do a quick dry fit of the cabinet just as a sanity check to make sure that everything lines up nicely. With the miter sled still set up from the previous cuts, I get these vertical dividers cut to their final length, and then I can begin the marking and layout for the dowel joinery here. In the past, I've done dados for all of the dividers, whether they were the horizontal, vertical, full length, or partial. I did dados. In this case, I'm switching to dowels for the full-length vertical dividers, and then I'll do dados later on for the short horizontal dividers. Now I'm just marking out center lines for each of the rows of dowels. You can see that I etched the center line on my jig here. It's pretty faint, but then I line it up with my pencil mark, clamp down this aluminum square I made, and then get the holes drilled. As I progressed, I realized that I only had to clamp the jig down for that first hole, and once that first one was drilled, I could use the reference pin and just hold the jig down against the fence, and everything came out just as well. Once again, I'm doing another sanity check to make sure everything lines up nicely before I move on. Now this cabinet is actually upside down in this clip, but on the right side in this case, that is where the door will be, and that's why that first divider is solid mahogany instead of pine. Now on to the 455 dados that I have to route. This is a jig that I came up with, and it's cut out on the CNC, and it allows me to do two things. One, it makes sure that the spacing of the dados is even and precise. In this case, it's 6.5 inches. The other thing it allows me to do is route dados on either side of the board so that they are perfectly lined up. In the past, I've had issues where those dados come out the edge of a board and you can see a slight offset. Maybe it's only a 32nd of an inch, but that adds up over a large project, and it's also something that just kind of jumps out at you when you're looking at it. So this jig has been pretty helpful, especially on this large of a project. You can see that I cut the first two dados, and then I'll slide the board over, and I'll use these two registration blocks to lock it in place, route the next one, rinse, and repeat. For this cabinet, the inner dividers are 5/8 of an inch thick, so that's what the mortising bit in the router is. And it's surrounded by a guide bushing that slips into the slot of the jig. So you can see I flipped over the board with the blocks still in place, and then I'll route the first two slots on the other side, slip in the blocks, and then I can remove the blocks from the other side, and so on and so forth. This goes on for years and years. Here's a closer look at the registration blocks. The narrow part registers the dado, whereas the wider part registers the slot in the jig, and together that keeps everything lined up nicely. Now if you're wondering, wow, this is a really long video, it's because half of it is me trying to push down on this epoxy pump, which seems to take forever. Anyways, I'm using this Total Boat epoxy with a slow hardener for the glue up because I knew that this was going to be a long glue up and I wanted to have as much open time as possible. Now I preloaded the dividers with their dowels so that I didn't have to mess with that as I progressed through the glue up. I got all of that set up with wood glue ahead of time, and then I could move on to applying the epoxy, installing the dividers, and then eventually adding the clamps. Now my clamp of choice for the middle of the cabinet was pocket hole screws. These worked out really well. I was actually quite excited how well they worked. They drew the two pieces together nicely, unlike any clamping setup that I'd be able to do by myself. I don't have any long reach clamps that would get to the middle of that cabinet, and setting up calls all by myself would just kind of be a recipe for disaster. I took a second mortgage out and ended up buying 10 of these 48-inch DeWalt parallel clamps, And the reason is I just simply needed them for this project, and I also have an Apothecary cabinet that's even bigger than this coming up right after this project, so having these on hand was a worthy investment in my mind. And for the outside corners, I can use these pipe clamps, and the reason I don't use pipe clamps on the rest of the project is because the pipe has to stick down further than the workbench will allow. So I needed those parallel clamps for the inner portion, and then I can use these pipe clamps for the outer portion. You can see here how that pipe is sliding down beyond the workbench, and then it'll just kind of close up this joint nicely. With the cabinet and clamps, I can begin work on the horizontal dividers. I have 4 of these pine panels that I glued up earlier, and they also have the mahogany edging. These are all full length as far as the horizontal portion of the project is concerned, so that I can keep a continuous grain along the width of the project. I kept them slightly oversized as far as the thickness is concerned, so that I can now sand them down so that they fit the dados perfectly. Once again, I used epoxy for the open time, and I used a brush to apply it to each and every one of these dados. I made sure not to apply too much towards the back of the dado, because I knew as I inserted the divider, it would push that epoxy down, and I didn't want to have just a ton of epoxy spilling out the back of this cabinet. Most of these went in pretty easily. They needed a little bit of persuasion as they were getting fully seated, but overall this was pretty uneventful. This last divider is always the most tricky to get installed, but this isn't my first rodeo, so I just hit it with the hammer as hard as I could. I like to use a hand plane as much as possible when flushing up all these faces. A sander will sort of leave little dips and valleys, whereas a hand plane leaves a nice crisp edge. In most of my Apothecary cabinets or chests, I have about 3 rows. As you can see, the one on that little workbench has 3 rows. I can usually get 3 half-inch pieces of material from an 8/4 board, but in this situation I have 5 rows, so I specifically ordered a 16/4 chunk of mahogany for the drawer fronts of this project. It was a little bit more expensive, but obviously it was worth it for the overall look, as you'll see later on. I took it over to the jointer to get one face cleaned up, and then I'll take it over to the table saw to begin the resawing process. This is a bit unconventional as far as resawing a board this thick for drawer fronts, but I made all of my cuts at the table saw before heading over to the bandsaw. So I just set my fence at 5/8 or 3/4 of an inch, made my cut, flipped the board, made the other cut, and then I would move the fence over, and you can see the result of that. I have 8 total cuts on this board, and then I can head over to the bandsaw now and release the rest of that material. Luckily there wasn't too much tension in that 16/4 board, so these boards stayed relatively flat. This one only needed 2 passes at the joiner to get it completely flat on one face before taking it over to the planer to bring it down to a 1/2 inch thick. I get all of the drawer fronts ripped to their final width, which corresponds to the height of the drawers, which is 6.5 inches. Now before moving my fence, I also get the drawer sides ripped to the same width so that they all match up. This is just like a little Easter egg for the project, but all of the drawer sides and backs are also book match panels made out of soft maple. At the crosscut sled, I can get the drawer fronts cut to their final length, which is the same as the width of the drawers, which is 11.5 inches. I have a brass setup bar just taped to my fence to use as a little stop. That way the piece doesn't get jammed as I'm making the crosscut. After cutting these pieces, I make sure to label them with some blue tape because they all have the same grain, so it's really easy to mix them up. I'm using a half-blind lock joint for the joinery on these drawers, and I've done a video on this in the past, which I'll link below and above and to the left and to the right. This is a pretty simple joint once you get the hang of it. The most critical aspect is the setting of your fence, which has to correspond to the thickness of your blade, plus a little bit just so that the joint's not too tight. Gluing these up was a bit of a bottleneck for the project because I could only glue up 4 or 5 of them at a time with the parallel clamps that I have on hand. I didn't feel like using those 48-inch DeWalt ones on this because it would just be a little too crazy and heavy to move around, so I used the Jet and Bessie ones that I have on hand and was able to do 4 or 5 at a time, so I had to kind of sneak out, glue some up, wait a couple hours, come back out and glue up more of them, and this took a couple days to kind of get all of them done. Now for the tedious process of fitting all of these drawers into the cabinet. I actually didn't get much footage of this, and I got a lot less than I really wanted to show, but I kept saying I would film the next one and I just didn't. I kept doing these in batches and I just kind of lost track of everything. But I start off with a block plane to smooth out the top and bottoms, and then one of my new techniques for drawers of this size is to run them over the joiner with a super light pass on the sides. The end grain of the drawer front doesn't get damaged because I'm leading with it. This is, I would say, somewhat sketchy, but I felt comfortable doing it and it left me with a pretty good fit. I took a break from fitting some of the drawers and got started with the door. I knew this was something that I hadn't done much of in the past, so I wanted to get started on it and take my time doing it. I used more of the 16-quarter mahogany to get started with it, and I did the same resaw method I did with the drawer fronts, and this will be the panel of the door. It's going to be a simple frame and panel. The frame will just be, rails and stiles joined with dowels, and then this will be a 1/4-inch panel that goes in the middle. Alright, I didn't leave. I'm still here. I didn't have much to say about the construction of the door. It's just simple dowels. But I routed some grooves for the panels, and I made sure to keep the grain aligned and continuous from the bottom to the top panel, and that's what you see here. This is just a quick dry fit. I actually did not film the glue up, but it was pretty uneventful. I don't really have much to offer as far as installing hinges is concerned. I'm not really the guy to hear it from. I don't do this often, so I don't want to give you too much advice. The only advice I would give you is to just do a few tests until you get the fit and reveal that you're after. These are inset hinges because the door is an inset door, so they might be a little bit different than using an overlay or a partial overlay door and hinge. Now this is the first time that I was clipping the door together, and it was about as good as I could have hoped for. There was a little bit of rubbing on one edge of the door, so I just had to adjust the hinges slightly, and then after this you can see that I did take a smidge off with the track saw to get the nice reveal that I was after. With most of the cabinet almost done, I began constructing the base for the cabinet. This is pretty simple. I've done it in the past. It's just legs attached to rails, and that's it. I'm using dowels to join it together. These legs are 1 3/4 inch square by 6 inches tall. I sanded them, I rounded the edges over before the glue up. This is a glue up of the short side, and I did both short sides at once, and then after that I glued the short sides together with the long rails. The rails are about 7/8 of an inch thick by 2 inches tall, And I didn't have clamps long enough for this glue up, so I don't mean to reveal the industry secret, but if you clamp to your workpiece, you can clamp against the clamp. It's just something you gotta know. And it wouldn't be a woodworking video if I didn't complain about how much sanding there was, so here it is. There was a lot of it. Not much else to say about it. I did add an 1/8 inch roundover to all of the edges of the drawers. This took a while just because there's a lot of edges on each drawer, but it was just a matter of finding the right rhythm as far as which edges to do in what order, but after a few of them I kind of got into a good little groove. With the cabinet back on the workbench, I flipped it onto its back and continued with the 1/8 inch radius roundovers on all of the edges. And here we are to the finish. I'm applying Rubio Monocoat Oil plus 2C Pure, and I'm using a white Scotch-Brite pad to apply it. A little bit goes a long way with this. A lot of these hard wax oils, you barely need anything to cover a complete surface. After you cover the surface, you're going to kind of let it sit and then wipe the excess off with a clean towel. I like to use these blue shop towels, and in this instance I was doing about 5 drawers at a time, and then I would clean off the drawer fronts. Likewise for the door here, I did the whole door by itself, wiped off the excess, and then moved on to another part of the build. Now, one of the perks of Rubio Monocoat is that you only really need to apply 1 coat, hence the name. But for this project, I decided to add 2 coats to all the surfaces. And the reason I did that is because every once in a while you'll have a portion of a board that is a little bit more thirsty, or you might miss a portion of it. And after going back, you'll notice that it needed some more oil. So I decided to just go with a 2nd coat. And the 2nd coat does not need nearly as much oil, so it's not like you're really wasting any material here. And it also does build up a small bit of a sheen relative to a single coat. So in my opinion, that was a perk, especially for a build like this. Next, I added the bottoms of the drawers, and I left these out for most of the build just because they're easier to handle without the bottoms in place. And I also added a backer panel to the cabinet, which was a 1/4 inch piece of mahogany veneer plywood. And then the last step was to add the handles to the drawers. Now, these handles were a slight upgrade for what I usually quote for a project, and that's just a cost that's added on to the customer, but this is what they chose. And these came with nails, which was a little bit more tedious than screws, but I figured out a good workflow. I have this little jig. I drill some partial holes with the drill bit there, and that just gets me a registration point for the nails to get started, and then I can finally seat them with a nail set right there, and then it's off to the cabinet. And that's about it for this one. If you've made it this far, I do appreciate you watching. This was a very fun build, and I was up against a bit of a deadline. I got this done in the beginning of the week, and the clients are coming from out of town to pick it up at the end of the week, so everything worked out nicely. I would say that my favorite part of this build is the door. That panel is just amazing in my opinion. The book match came out nicely, and I was really glad that I got that 16/4 board because the row by row grain match, that continuous grain across the length of the cabinet, I think just looks very nice. If you have any questions about any topics that I might have glossed over or skipped or anything like that, please let me know in the comments below. I have another build like this coming up soon. It'll be made out of solid walnut, so I'll try to address any of those questions in that video. And if you want to see projects like this while they're in progress, follow me on Instagram at Parillaworks. Thanks for watching.